Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on what time zone you are joining us today. My name is Kimberly Flowers. I'm a senior associate with the CSIS Global Food Security Program. And today you're joining us to talk about the impact of climate change on addressing antimicrobial resistance in low and middle income countries. And of course, this couldn't come at a more opportune time with what's happening right now in Glasgow with the International Climate Change Conference. And so climate change is certainly on a lot of people's minds, but I'm not really sure that antimicrobial resistance is. And that's something that we're going to be talking about today with some experts really coming to this topic from very different angles, which is fantastic. As you might know, there's been some recent evidence, though many would argue that we need a lot more, of how global climate change or rising global temperatures could increase or accelerate the rate of antimicrobial resistance. And we're going to be talking today about sort of all these connections between human health and climate and agriculture and sort of our food systems and how all of those are connected. This event today wouldn't have been possible without a partnership with the Danish government, and we at CSIS are very grateful for that. I have to say, on a personal note, one of my first ever events when I was a director at CSIS previously was with the Danish government back in 2015. And one of my major international events that I did before I left CSIS was with the Danish government. About 2 years ago, I moderated the multi-day World Food Summit in Copenhagen. So if you're unaware, a lot of people know this, but the Danish government is truly at the forefront in terms of combating climate change. Just last month, their parliament committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture and the forestry sectors by 55% and 65% respectively by 2030. They're also one of the leaders, I would say, in understanding and working to combat antimicrobial resistance, particularly using the One Health strategy, which one of our panelists, Robert, will talk about, I'm sure, more. They've been one of the drivers behind banning the use of growth promoters in animal production. And they are also, along with the World Bank, helped create the International Center for Antimicrobial Resistance, or ICARS, which is an international independent research and knowledge center that focuses on the intervention and implementation research in low and middle income countries on this issue. So it's no surprise why the Danes are a leader in this and why they wanted to partner with us to talk about this. And it's now my pleasure to introduce for some welcoming remarks and introductory remarks, His Excellency Rasmus Prehn. He is the Minister for Food, Agriculture and Fisheries for Denmark.
For inviting me to speak at your event. COVID-19 has reminded us of the catastrophic potential of infectious diseases. It has shown us how vulnerable our globally interconnected societies are. The pandemic has also highlighted the importance of today's topic, the mission to tackle antimicrobial resistance. We see an unfortunate emergence and spread of resistant microorganisms in humans, animals, and the environment. Organisms that are no longer affected by the medicine that once stopped them. Antimicrobial resistance is a slow-moving tsunami. It is a major threat to the health of humans, livestock, and environment. It challenges our societies and our economies. This is why tackling antimicrobial resistance was one of the focal points of Denmark leading up to the United Nations Food System Summit. And this is why Denmark, along with international partners, took the initiative to establish the International Center for Antimicrobial Resistance Solutions, or simply ICARS, in 2019. ICARS is an independent organization that works across sectors and in countries where antimicrobial resistance is a particular challenge. The focus of ICARS is especially the low and middle income countries. ICARS offers technical advice and support for practical implementation of local action plans against antimicrobial resistance. ICARS then develops a tailored toolbox in partnership with the countries and offers help on the implementation. Some guiding principles are evidence-based and cost-effective solutions. In other words, relevant and accessible solutions. Furthermore, ICARS takes a One Health approach with a combined focus on human, animal, and environmental health. Antimicrobial resistance is a global development problem, and international action is needed from countries and partners with the resources to address this challenge. I believe that ICARS is a part of the international solution. And I therefore think countries such as the United States should consider joining as a founding or supporting member. So do spread the word about the good work that ICARS is trying to do. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to the Danish government for your leadership in this and your partnership with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So let's turn to our panelists. I'll introduce them all quickly so you know who we're talking to, and then we'll get started on this conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Rod Schoonover. He is, like me, a senior associate with the Global Food Security Program, but he's also the head of the Ecological Security Program at the Council on Strategic Risks. I first got Rod on my radar when he was the Director of Environment and Natural Resources and the Director of Global Health at the National Intelligence Council when he was with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. We also have with us Robert Skov, who is the Scientific Director at ICARS, what the Minister was referring to, the International Center for Antimicrobial Resistance. He is a medical doctor and a specialist in microbiology, and he has been working on these issues for 25 years. So for those of you that this is the first time you've heard of this, it is not new, and he can talk to us about how this has expanded or changed over the years. And then we're very happy to have Dr. Tabitha Kamani joining us from East Africa. She's the regional economist. I don't know why that's coming out wrong. My apologies, Dr. Kamani. She's also the AMR coordinator for Eastern Africa for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States. So she's a policy and animal production expert, and she's working on the regional surveillance and practice of antimicrobial resistance in East Africa for the FAO's working group. So what a great group that we have with us today. And audience members, I certainly encourage you as you're listening and learning, maybe you're an expert on this, maybe this is brand new. We welcome your questions and we'll take some of those at the end. So please put that in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. But first, I want to start with you, Rod, because like I've mentioned a couple of times, and I think a lot of people are kind of unclear what all of this really is and if it's really a threat or not a threat. So why don't you start with helping us understand the basics of antimicrobial resistance and how it relates to climate change, human health, and food systems? I know that's a big question, but if you're explaining this to a policymaker that has no idea what we're talking about, what do you say? And is it a real threat?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for CSIS for inviting me. My background is right there at the intersection of science and security. And both of these issues separately and combined are good examples of that intersection. So AMR and climate change have both been discussed as among the most pressing issues of the 21st century. But rarely are they discussed as intersecting issues, which is, as Kimberly said, something I just want to touch on. So AMR is often discussed as a consequence of indiscriminate or outright misuse of antimicrobials, which is assuredly a serious problem, but I think often overlooked and underappreciated is the environmental component of AMR in soil and water systems. And I think we have to remember that microbes have been at war with each other for billions of years, notably bacteria and fungi. And even Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin accidentally from an accidental exposure to a type of mold. So, bacteria developed antibiotic resistance as part of this arms race. So antibiotic resistance can develop through mutation and pass to daughters through a vertical gene transfer. This is what you might see, for example, in a petri dish where bacteria is grown in the presence of antibiotics. But bacteria in the real world also employ horizontal gene transfer, where resistance genes are passed to each other. So both bacterial growth rates and horizontal gene transfer are known to be influenced by increases in temperature. And so that's where climate change comes in. I'll focus only on the temperature component, but there are other pathways of influence from climate change. A 2018 study in the journal Nature Climate Change showed that antimicrobial antibiotic resistance, in this case, increases with local temperature. And they found that a 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature was associated with a 2 to 4% increase in antibiotic resistance. Now, that may not sound like a lot, and certainly diplomats who are currently engaged in Glasgow are focused on keeping the global average temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. So 10 degrees sounds wildly higher than that. But I think we have to really remember the timescales that microbes operate under, which is minutes to days. And a 10 degrees Celsius increase, or even multiples of that, are not only possible, but highly likely in a number of environmental systems. So in short, just by not looking at the linkages of AMR and climate change, we are almost certainly underappreciating the dangers of both.
And I'm going to follow up with one more question before I move on to Robert. Do you think this is on the minds of the Biden administration? I asked that because the minister made remarks of, pushing U.S. to join ICARS as a founding member. But do you think this is on their radar at all?
I think it is. I bet that it's underappreciated by the climate community and the AMR community, which is one of the reasons why this is an important conversation to have, because of the intersections. I think even in the academic world, this is an underexplored, field of study. There was a National Academies report that came out last week or 2 weeks on AMR, where it mentions the overlaps with climate change. So these efforts are only going to help spread the awareness of these, I think, fairly deep interlinkages.
And Robert, I know in previous conversations you've talked about how we don't have enough research, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But I'd also like for you to talk to us a little bit about more how this kind of connects with food systems, but particularly of this One Health. What does One Health mean? How does this connect to this? And I'm going to ask you one more question is, what's the worst case scenario? If we don't do anything, how bad could it really be?
Really bad. So thank you very much, Kimberly, for having me, first of all. And also thank you very much for CSSI to put this one on the agenda. As Roger's rightly saying, everybody speaks on climate change, more and more speaks on AMR, but very few actually speaks on that the climate change actually also will directly and indirectly affect AMR. But getting back to your questions about One Health. So we have to realize that even though antibiotic resistance is a natural phenomenon, as Rod said, the use of antibiotics is really speeding everything up. It is speeding it up in the way that it increases the new gain of resistance, both in these from bacteria to bacteria, the horizontal gene transfer, but also the mutation rates. And one has to realize that this goes for all use of antibiotics, both the good use and the bad use. And regardless if you use it in soil, on plants, in animals, or in humans. So wherever you use it, you increases the selective pressure on the bacteria to increase their resistance levels. And this is where the One Health really comes in. Because today there is really, or at least to a large tendency, to look at each sector separately. We look at, the human beings, we look at the animals, and very often forget actually what we're doing in agriculture, but we can come back to that. But the thing is that this year, the exchange of microorganisms and thereby also exchange of microorganisms that are resistant is really throughout the whole spectrum. So we get resistant bacteria from the animals, both the pet animals and the husbandry animals, where we furthermore also through the food chain, as well as we as human beings, gives microbes back to the animals. So it is really very complex, and I can easily understand if a layman really thinks that this is really getting way over my head. But the easy thing to see here is that whenever you use antibiotics, you affect not only the bacteria you intend to kill, but you actually infect the whole ecosystem. And the ecosystem is one of the most important things in order to actually have a balance in the world. You have to remember that each individual carries more bacteria on your surface, inner or outer surface, that you have cells in your body. And this is a good thing. And if you don't have those, it would be catastrophic. So getting back to the last thing, how bad can it go? Well, there is some different projections on how bad it can go, but before we get that bad, it can easily turn bad already. It's now more than 10 years ago that we had reports of bacteria which we virtually have no antibiotics left to treat. So simply not one single antibiotic is left in the cupboard to treat these. Such infections are still rare, but they are increasingly there. And it has been estimated that we can go as high as 10 million deaths a year due to AMR in 2050, should we get into this worst case scenario.
Yeah, I think that's a statistic that not a lot of people know, or a prediction. I mean, and we don't know for sure if it will happen, but I remember reading that when I was looking up to prepare for this, and I was completely shocked by reading that. Well, I'd like to turn now to Tabitha. This morning, Tabitha, as I got in the car and I had NPR on the radio, they were talking about protests outside of Glasgow, kind of referring to how the industrialized world, I don't like that terminology, but the Western countries have been, or to blame for what's happening in terms of what we're seeing with climate change. But of course, as we know, the impacts of climate change is happening in the developing world, and they're bearing the brunt, unfortunately, of the climate change crisis. So talk to us a little bit about what you see in terms of how does this manifest itself in East Africa, and what are some of the things that you're working on in particular there related to antimicrobial resistance and climate change?
Thank you, Kimberly, for having me in this panel, and we appreciate the invitation. Let me say that Africa, and particularly even Eastern Africa, they have begun to wake up to the threat of AMR. And basically what we see is that most of the countries following the global call to develop national action plans, they have developed national action plans. But let me say, we still don't know the burden of AMR because very little data is flowing out in terms of from the surveillance systems. So even the policymakers or the governments don't have quite a clear picture of what the burden looks like. And so we are facing a situation where we see very little investments by government into AMR activities. But I also appreciate that we do have several donor-funded projects in the region that are trying to, to start off some activities to generate the data, so that this data can be used for advocacy and policy. In terms of how the climate change and AMR are manifesting are linked in East Africa, the previous panelists talked about the direct link, but what we are seeing more in Eastern Africa is the indirect link, and particularly through the dimensions of AMR and environment. Because particularly the Horn of Africa is experiencing a lot of climate change effects, particularly drought and floods. And what we are seeing is that these two phenomena are, they are increasing or accelerating the environmental dimensions of AMR. Because particularly we have a problem of hygiene, sanitation, and waste disposal in this region. Countries have put in legislations, but we have sometimes inadequate legislations. Other times we have poor implementation of these legislations. So what is happening is that already there are bad practices that are happening, and we have a lot of discharge of resistant bacteria, some of them resistant into the environment. We also have discharge of antimicrobials in the environment. But when you have flooding, what is happening is that now you have a situation where this occurrence is being increased. Drought again is forcing particularly the animal health dimensions in terms of when animals, they are malnourished because there isn't inadequate water and pasture. So the poor nutrition comes out as poor health. And so what pastoralists or herders are doing is that they are using antibiotics to try, thinking that the animals, if they pump in antibiotics combined with multivitamins, these animals are going to survive. Some of them go to an extent where they even they hold a lot of antibiotics in anticipation for drought, because they know they might move to areas where they can't access the drugs. So they might carry more than they need, and they are using more than they need. So the issue of overuse and misuse are being increased by these climate change effects in the Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabitha. So many good points in there. The need for good data and how you're collecting data and working on that. Overuse and misuse, of course, of antibiotics. But also just talking about the environment, in sense of the droughts and the floods. There's always like too much or too little rain, which especially in East Africa, we have so many farmers depending on rain. That can certainly make a change in food systems and livelihoods. My question, it's really to all of you, but I guess if Rod or Robert wanted to start, but do you see that AMR and climate change is going to look different in low and middle income countries, or the impact of that? Or would that look the same? Like, is it sort of universally bad, or would it look different in terms of the repercussions of what could happen here, or what is already happening in, say, East Africa or Southeast Asia versus, say, Europe? Any thoughts on that? Robert?
Thank you very much. Yes, definitely. And unfortunately, like with everything else, this year is really hitting the low resource countries the most. Just think of the sewage systems. If they are not really capable, not only to cope with the normal situations, but also with the weather disasters that we are seeing more and more. This is an excellent example where you have flooding, where you have overrun of sewage, which is filled with bacteria, and every place where the sewage systems are not well equipped to cope with these things. And unfortunately, this is really seen a lot more in low and middle income countries, and especially in the big cities. There you will see that. But again, we're going back to the One Health. You also see this in that you have these sewage overflooding your farmland, and there you will have a resistance spread into the agriculture and the livestock that is grassing or is nourishing on these farmlands. The same goes to lakes and the fish. So all in all of these things here really are hitting the low and middle income countries far, far greater than it hits the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can,
yeah, go ahead, Rod. Jump in. No,
just a really jump on that point. One of the things I think is not really well understood is the role of nitrogen fertilizers, which are part and parcel with food security, and how they increase antibiotic resistance. And so when you have things like floods, that increases eutrophication. It's fairly well known that biofilms in freshwater lake systems are antibiotic resistance hotspots, again, for horizontal gene transfer. And so I think that's a really important component to think about in terms of antibiotic resistance.
If I can add, Kimberly,
yes, please.
I think one other dimension in developing countries is these are countries that are already having challenges in terms of resources. They already have competing priorities. So in terms of marshalling enough or doing enough to address AMR, like I said, we haven't seen governments setting aside funds for AMR. So the fact that they don't even have enough resources and they have competing interests, some of them are going through political instability. So that will complicate the fact that they are not well prepared to deal with climate change in itself, the effects of climate change, and they're well prepared to deal with AMR as it is. And now when you combine the two of them, I think it will overwhelm these countries, and it's likely to be bad as predicted.
And a question that we already have from the audience member, I'm just going to jump in, but Tabitha, do you feel like in East Africa that folks have access to the antibiotics that are being overused? I mean, I think you mentioned it before, but is there anything you want to comment on that?
We have two dilemmas here to limit access, but we also have communities that have poor access, and these are particularly and access comes in two ways. In terms of physical access, that they can't go to and find these antibiotics which they need in the local market. And sometimes they have financial access issues that they are not able to afford. So they use something inferior because they can't afford. So we do have those issues. And I think the dilemma is how to balance the two issues of trying to limit access and also trying to improve access. And those are some of the works we are doing in terms of policies and legislations, and also some of the behavior change work we are doing as a field.
Yeah. Let's talk about what's happening in Glasgow right now. You know, I've sort of made some comments and I asked Rod at the beginning, like, is this on anybody's radar screen? But I'm curious if any of you can answer, but is this being talked about in Glasgow? Was it talked about at the UN Food Systems Summit? Like, or is it just talked about amongst a few? And how do you get it on the radar of policymakers when there's so much in terms of priorities and issues just around climate change? How do you move this up to the top of the policy agenda Rod, what do you think? Is it being
Yeah.
talked about at all, or is it maybe one little side conversation?
I would be surprised if it were being discussed in Glasgow. And I think that is really a symptom of the way we think about climate change. Climate change is generally thought of as an environmental issue. We have talked already about the environmental component of AMR, but usually we talk about it at the tail end instead of probably it's the dominant effect. But, if just a couple of days ago, I downloaded the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 3,000 pages in the full report, right? It's the scientific basis of the existence of climate change and humanity's fingerprint on that. And if you do a search on antimicrobial, you get 0 hits. And it's because we have historically thought of climate change's effects in a meteorological sense. What are the effects on droughts and storms and heat? But when you change the temperature of the planet, it's not really an environmental issue. It has the potential to affect every physical, chemical, biological, ecological, industrial process, and certainly the emergence of AMR is, after all, at the very basic mechanism is a molecular process. So of course the temperature affects this, and so I think these two different worlds, right? Climate change and AMR live in two different worlds primarily. Need to be nudged together because they both are some of the most pressing issues of the next 100 years.
Robert, do you agree?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better than Rod is doing here. I can just, add a bit of factor to this one here. And just to look at the temperature, does that really have an effect? And there is a great study here rather recently from Europe. So just looking at the 30 countries across Europe, looking at the temperature, and they were looking at the prevalence of what we call multi-drug resistant organisms. That means that this is bacteria that are resistant to several classes of antibiotics, leaving few left. And they looked at some of the bad guys, if you would want to say like that, and in almost 1 million clinical samples, more than 900,000 clinical samples over 6 years. And just in these 6 years here, they could see that the almost 80% of the variance between the country in one of the bacteria called a Pseudomonas, almost 80% of the variance in the levels of persistent bacteria could be explained by temperature difference. So as Rod is saying, this year has a huge impact. And we can, at least here in Northern Europe, we can clearly see an increasing trend of the middle temperature. So just to say to you that regardless what we are calling it, if the temperature is increasing, the bugs are in several direct and indirect ways is thriving better. And that actually means that we see these things here. So I can only corroborate what just Rod was saying.
So I'm going to ask not a theoretical question, but sort of a hypothetical, I guess, a dream question, which is, if you kind of had all the money in the world and all the political will in the world, I know those two things are not going to happen necessarily, but what are some of the solutions to really address this? Like if you really had the money and the will to get some things really changed, particularly in low and middle income countries, what are the programs, what are the policies that could really work? And Tabitha, I'd like to start with you. Like if you, again, were given, like you're in charge of the world and you're given everything you needed, what are the real big change makers or changes that need to happen to try to address this problem?
Okay, if I had all the resources that I need to do everything that needs to be done, I think some key in terms of the logical steps of what we need is, particularly we need to understand, we need more data, particularly understanding the extent of the problem. Because I'm saying this because sometimes we are thinking that if we reduce consumption of antimicrobials in low and medium income countries, that might be the best solution. But we still don't have data in terms of how much resistance that has already happened, so that now we can try to put in policies that address that risk and looking at best ways to do that. From being an economist, the first thing I would look for is data to first see the extent of the problems, looking at the behavior, the bad practices that are happening. We already know them, but we would like to see more in terms of what are the drivers for these bad behaviors. Are they socioeconomic? Because sometimes we think we can implement a legislation and people just behave that way. People won't behave until they have incentives. So we want to understand the incentives that will make the people change. So behavior change and data would be one areas I would put a lot of money on, and behavior change would touch both on how they use antimicrobials, the good agricultural practices that reduce consumption and reduce environmental contamination with wastes, farm wastes. So those are some of those areas I would invest money in. And that is, we are doing that now, but in very low scales, that it's very difficult to have any impact. Yeah,
you're definitely an economist. That's why, it's fantastic that you bring up data, though. Rod, as a scientist, would you agree? Is data, of course, behavior change as well, but if you had all the money in the world, what would you do with it? Besides going on vacation.
Yeah, I thought those comments were outstanding. Better understanding the problem, I think, is really crucial, because, a lot of what the arguments that I presented were really plausibility arguments more than, hard knowledge. We talked about temperature. What's the effect of carbon dioxide itself? What is the effect of soil? Soil biodiversity, microbiodiversity. What is the effect on water systems? We're really at the beginning of understanding the problem. And so, just if you look back at how these problems have come about, there's one has to do with the use of antimicrobials on healthy animals to promote growth. Are there ways to be more targeted? Can science help us, be more targeting in terms of, in aquaculture as well as livestock? So, as a scientist, I want not just more data. I want better methodology and just basic science.
Yeah, there's the scientist in you. Absolutely. Robert, how about you? Did they nail it, or what else would you add to that?
They definitely nailed it, but I would like to see some action, actually. So if I had the money, I think the first thing I would think of, first of all, is clean water and good sanitation and sewage, so we can separate clean water from sewage. That would in itself mean tremendous, not only on AMR, but also on the well-being of people in total. Then I have two things more, being very practical. One is diagnostics, that you actually have the possibility to see if what you want to treat is actually treatable. So what we know today is that most use in humans is in upper respiratory tract infections, where 70% is due to viruses, and antibiotics have no effect on viruses. Rod has talked about growth promotion. This is antibiotics used just to increase growth speed. That means that the animals are not sick. You give them tiny bits of antibiotics that don't kill bacteria, but actually really accelerate the creation of AMR. So diagnostics, because one thing I really want to say, because we're speaking as if antibiotics is the worst in the world. Antibiotics is one of the best things in the world. They just need to be used rightfully. And I think better diagnostics would help on that. And lastly, we need to think about biosecurity and infection control. It's so simple. We have learned to wash our hands here in the COVID. Let's keep on washing our hands. Let's keep on doing biosecurity measures. Just things like a hospital where you have doors in your operating theater that can be closed and which is not defect. It may sound ridiculous, but it's actually the case in very many cases. And so bacteria cannot fly, I usually say. They are carried around by humans or animals. So if you really look at very cheap interventions, that is by the behavior that Tabitha was speaking on, changing behavior to prevent spread of bacteria or to minimize it. So from a very practical point, those were the things that I would add on.
Thank you. Those are great answers. I want to turn to questions that we're getting from our audience members and encourage folks to continue to put questions in the Q&A section for our panelists. But I have to ask, because you brought it up, Robert, the pandemic, if there's one thing we've sort of seen or now felt or whatever you want to say, is how one virus can kind of shut down the whole world and had such a tremendous impact that none of us have seen in our lifetimes, and hopefully we won't see again. But I am curious, and I would like to hear each of your brief thoughts on this before we turn to the audience questions. But how has the pandemic, and I want to spin it in a positive way, but what have we learned from the pandemic that you think could be useful to either increasing attention or increasing understanding of what we need to do to address antimicrobial resistance and climate change? And we'll go backwards. So I'd like to go Robert, Rod, and Tabitha. So Robert, any thoughts on pandemic lessons in a positive way?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, we have learned what hand hygiene really means. We also learned that if you stay at home when you have a cold, you don't infect your fellow beings. So with a bit of thought, you can actually really get rid of a lot of infectious diseases. And that has an indirect effect on AMR as well, because if you don't feel sick, you don't go to the doctor, ask for antibiotics. So it really would, so that is one of the really positive effects from the pandemic. So let us please all remember those hygienic lessons that we have learned.
Yeah. Rod, positive lessons from the pandemic?
Well, I couldn't have said it better than Robert. I think one of the things that we really should keep in mind, and maybe it's not the positive that you're hoping for, but we tend to think of AMR as a creeping, gradual, concern. We've thought about infectious diseases in the same way, but here we see, we're in the middle, probably at the tail end of one of the biggest disruptive events in modern history. And so I think it's a lesson, I think a cautionary lesson that we sometimes may think of things as gradual changes when maybe they present step changes that we need to be alert for.
Yeah. Tabitha, what are your thoughts on the pandemic? And then we'll move quickly to other questions. Tabitha?
I think one of the things that is coming out, which is positive in a way, is that these programs, and it can apply to AML, as much as it is a problem that needs to be primarily resolved by the One Health sectors, environment, animal health, and public health. Everyone needs to be involved, because when the problem hits, it affects everyone. For example, before COVID, no airline ever thought that they can shut down because of a public health threat. But this, and what we are seeing in countries now, is when they are the task forces that are dealing with COVID are multi-agency. They are beyond the 3 sectors. They have pulled in security. They have pulled in very many government departments. And this shows that we need to think AML beyond the 3 sectors that are dealing with it now.
I want to save the rest of our time, which is only 15 minutes. So we'll have to do this, of course, quick, because there's a lot of great questions coming in. So as we go through these, we won't have time for all of our panelists to answer them. So I'll just say either answer briefly or pick and choose, and I'll just open it to all of you. But the first one I'd like to ask is related to studies. Are there studies ongoing to take advantage of the natural experiments of recent floodings in Europe and drought in the Western United States and in sub-Saharan Africa? Anybody want to take that? Are there studies ongoing to take advantage of the natural experiments of recent flooding in Europe and drought in the US? And it looks like Robert, you want to answer that one?
I can just say, no, I'm not aware of that. I know that we are looking into, the systems that we have here, and there are environmental research on this, but I'm not aware of any specific research in that sense here.
Okay, Rod or Tabitha, are you aware of any research on that?
I'm not aware, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some. It is as the question rightly poses, the planet provides a number of natural experiments. So I think that would be a very interesting line of inquiry, especially since of the prevalence of nitrogen fertilizers in those areas. I think that would be very interesting.
So people who write grants out there, pay attention, right? There's something to do a new study on. The next question, are there examples of policies that have been enacted that have proven successful in addressing antimicrobials as growth promoters in livestock? Any thoughts on that one? Any policies that have been successful in addressing antimicrobials as growth promoters in livestock? Robert?
Well, so I'm a bit puzzled here. What the question is really. So because let me put it like this: Denmark banned growth promotion in we started in 1996 and we followed up until 2000. We have one of the largest animal productions in the world. This has not been hampered at all by ending growth promotion. Of course, there has been some effect of this, and I know that there has been some US studies indicating that stopping growth promotion would cost you 5 cents per kilo of retail meat if you don't add on all the percentages by in all the chain. But if you look at the raw thing, it's few cents. What we don't know, and I think we need to be honest about this, is in low and middle income countries, in completely different environment, what are actually the effect of growth promotion there, and what would be the effect of removing them there. But as we are speaking, ICARS is actually looking to provide the evidence that this year is actually doable also in these settings, not to use growth promotion.
Similar.
And I can add.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Tabitha. Sorry.
Okay, I'm not aware of data from Africa, but what I can say is that while some countries are advocating for banning of growth promoters, what we see is they don't have effective mechanism to track if they're compliance to this. So most of it is in legislation, but in a sense, there is no proof that this is something that feed manufacturers or producers are complying with. But that would be an interesting area to look at.
Another question related to livestock is, could supporting an increased demand in alternative proteins make an impact on livestock production and by extension, overuse of antimicrobials? So thinking about, maybe the Beyond Meat or pushing to a more vegetarian diet, at least that's how I read that, but increasing demand in those other areas, would that make an impact on livestock production and overuse of antimicrobials?
What we see in Eastern Africa is that would be an uphill task because we see increasing demand. For example, we do know that by 2050, some of the countries are going to record like increased demand that is threefold up to fourfold. Sometimes some products, some animal products will record higher than that in terms of demand. But what we are trying to see is, despite that increased demand, how do we make livestock systems sustainable such that as they intensify, they're going to use less antimicrobials? So that we are trying to focus more on those policies that touch on the urbanizing livestock value chains, because this is where you have a high density of people, of animals, of high use of antimicrobials if we don't do anything. And then a lot of it is going to be discharged into the environment. So we are working on policies that try to ensure that in these urbanizing livestock value chains, to supply the demand for meat or animal source foods are going to be sustainable. There's sustainable production and there's reduced use of antimicrobials.
Thanks. Robert, anything you want to add, or we can move on to another question? Okay. So another question coming in from the audience, it states that most of the lower and middle income countries have high temperatures and have high burdens of infectious disease. The use and misuse and overuse in human and animals is unmatched. So the question really is, what could be the alternative to antibiotics? I had a similar question in my preparation, which is sort of like, will we reach a post-antibiotic era? But I guess the question I'll ask is what with the audiences, which is, what could be an alternative to maybe the current antibiotics that we're using? Go ahead, Robert.
So just as I said before, we need to remember that antibiotics is actually it's a good. It actually is needed both for animals as well as for humans here. The problem is the overuse and the misuse. So there's definitely a lot of things we could do. First of all, IPC, infection prevention and control in the human setting, and biosecurity in the animal sector would really reduce the needs for antibiotics. Secondly, if one has access to diagnostics, again, then you could target your treatment to whenever that is reasonable. And then there is a couple of things which is indirectly. If you're not in good health, and that Tabitha has said that previously, if your animals are not healthy, they are more prone to get sick, and thereby increasing the demand for antibiotics, and then the vicious circle. And the same goes for humans. So actually getting back to healthy, sick human beings, healthy human beings and healthy animals will do a lot in preventing the use of antibiotics. Just think of the tuberculosis. We really have reduced that in the Western Europe and in US simply by having a better housing of our people. So there is so much other things that is inflicting on these things here. So good health would actually mean a lot, and thereby, good food, good water, and all of these things. So it's not only the antibiotics in itself, but also other things. Over.
In livestock, I would add that animal vaccinations, because what we see is that there is low coverage in terms of vaccinations. And when you have these vaccine preventable disease outbreaks, they're using a lot of antibiotics. Actually, we did a study in Kenya where we found that importantly, out of the 10 first diseases which farmers were using antibiotics on, 5 could be prevented through vaccinations, and another 5 could be prevented just through good farm biosecurity and hygiene. So these are some of the alternative practices that we can push that can reduce consumption of antimicrobials even before we think about use of such things like probiotics.
Thank you both. Another question's coming in from the audience is wanting to elaborate a little bit more on how that increase of temperature and how that really connects to the rise or exacerbation of antimicrobial resistance. Rod, can you take that one?
Yeah, I think it's an important question that really needs to be studied more. But so remember that at the basis of antibiotic resistance are molecular molecular processes. So it's known that the growth rate and the reproduction rate of bacteria are temperature dependent. It's a very basic relationship. And therefore, there a rise of point mutations that can be passed to daughter cells is affected by temperature. And also, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, a lot of resistance is actually passed through resistance genes horizontally from bacteria to bacteria. So there are 3 types of these processes, at least 3, transformation and transduction. And I'm blanking on the third, transformation, transduction, and conjugation. I had to go back to my bacteriology. All 3 of these are molecular processes that are impacted by temperature. And so studies have shown that horizontal gene transfer is increased generally, not in every case, with temperature. And so there's also just a whole number of other effects like the promotion of biofilms, which are in turn also hotspots for horizontal gene transfer. So there are a number of different ways to answer that question, but that's kind of getting at the basic mechanism.
I'd like to ask one last question from the audience before we wrap up. And the question is there an opportunity for funding for antimicrobial resistance initiatives by folding this into some of the national climate programs or other pieces of environmental legislation that's being debated, of course, right now on the global stage, but also in each country? There's a lot of leaders, obviously, finally focusing on this very much. So any opportunities that you see there for funding for initiatives like this being folded into other climate change programs? Any of you can answer that you'd like.
So just give a short one. Yes, definitely. We need to stop looking at things in silos. These are very well interconnected, and we definitely should do these things side by side, because instead of putting out 2 different research programs, why don't we combine these and actually do both simultaneously? So from my point of view, and absolutely yes.
And I'll jump in here. I think Robert is exactly right. I think we need to really think in terms of systems. We invented systems thinking, several decades ago. We should implement it in our policy and in our research. And I think it's something notable that when people are talking about the pressures that come from climate change, antimicrobial resistance isn't even mentioned, but it may be one of the most impactful ways in which climate change affects people in the future.
Well, and as the minister mentioned at the beginning and called it a silent tsunami, right? And I think I would also add an invisible silent tsunami for many. Tabitha, I would like to give you the final word. Anything else that you want to add, or just any final comments as we wrap up and thinking about this topic?
AML is a problem. We need to think more about it, about arresting. Like you said, it's an invisible, it's slow, but I guess when it hits, it will hit very hard. So it's better if we can be able to arrest it before we get there. Climate change and AML are both problems that are, they are global threats that are facing humanity now. And with or without much understanding of the links, in terms of saving resources and how we approach the issues, the people on the ground who are affected are the same. The same households that will be affected by climate change will be affected by AML. So we are better off integrating our way of approaching the two issues. There is no harm in approaching a farmer or producers to think about sustainable production that is climate smart, in addition to sustainable livestock production or agricultural production that limits transmission or occurrence of AML. They're one and the same persons, and maybe it's more cost effective if they do it holistically, and if we go to them once, then go to them on different dates, different teams. One team saying we are here for climate change, and another one comes tomorrow, we are here for AML. Why don't we go there as a team and we tell them we are here to address these two global threats together? Over.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tabitha. And thank you, Rod, and thank you, Robert. And thank you to everyone in our audience watching and submitting great questions. I hope you all continue to pay attention to what's happening in Glasgow. And my guess is that I hope that this conversation that may be kind of unique and unusual today will become much more common as we all think and learn more about antimicrobial resistance and how that is being impacted by climate change. Thank you all very much for joining us. Have a wonderful day, afternoon, or night. Take care.